When Jefferson entered the presidency, as I was mentioning the other day, he found that John Adams was very worried about a Republican taking over the presidency. When Jefferson entered the presidency, he discovered that John Adams was very worried about the fact that, for the first time, a member of the opposite party was in control. Can you appreciate that concern? Yes. Can you appreciate the concern of somebody entering the presidency who had never entered the presidency before? Do you think that you'll live long enough, for example, to see a socialist who will be elected president of the United States? Do you think that you will live long enough to see a woman be president of the United States? Do you think that you'll live long enough to see an African American be president of the United States? Apparently you have, haven't you? This created a degree of concern for Adams. And so Adams left behind what is called his midnight appointments, a list of midnight appointments. Many of these appointments would be individuals who would occupy a position in the federal judiciary. Many of these midnight appointments would be individuals who would have a position in the judiciary. And so Jefferson confronted this enormous reservoir of midnight appointments. And he asked a question. Did he have to respect the appointments? Did he have to respect the appointments? Did Jefferson have to respect the appointments? This sounds like a technical issue, and to a degree it is. But watch the way it turns out. One individual was a man named William Marbury. William Marbury, M-A-R-B-U-R-Y. And Jefferson challenges Marbury's appointment. Jefferson challenged whether Marbury should receive his job or not. In 1803, the case goes before the Supreme Court. The case is Marbury versus Madison. Marbury wants his job. Jefferson doesn't want to give him his job. Symbolic of all the other jobs that were on his desk. 1803, Marbury versus Madison. The question of whether Jefferson has to respect William Marbury's appointment. Ironically, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court had been an individual who also had gotten an appointment by John Adams. Ironically, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, was a cousin of Thomas Jefferson. But they both disliked one another. Jefferson and Marshall both disliked one another. Marshall makes the decision that Marbury should not get his appointment. Marshall makes the decision that Marbury should not receive the appointment. He should not receive the appointment. He should not receive the appointment because the Judiciary Act of 1789 had a flaw in it. The Judiciary Act of 1789 had a flaw in it. Marbury doesn't get the job. Marbury doesn't get the job. Marbury doesn't get the job. Marshall says the Judiciary Act of 1789 has a flaw in it. He says not only does it have a flaw in it, Marshall says the Judiciary Act of 1789 is what? Unconstitutional. The Judiciary Act of 1789 is unconstitutional. Something happened. Something happened here. Help me. What happened? That for the first time, the United States Supreme Court declared an act of Congress invalid. For the first time, this is a first time thing. For the first time, the United States Supreme Court declared an act of Congress invalid and unconstitutional. For the first time, for the very first time in this infant country, this infant nation, with infant institutions, an infant country, with infant institutions, John Marshall declared that an act of Congress was unconstitutional, and therefore established what we call the power of judicial review. The power of judicial review. The power of judicial review. Don't most people have an interpretation about, have a feeling about whether an act is constitutional or unconstitutional? Don't we debate this continually? But ultimately, whose opinion matters?
The Attorney General's.
Whose opinion matters?
The Supreme Court.
The United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's decision, their opinion, they are the ultimate interpreter of the Constitution. The United States Supreme Court is the ultimate interpreter of the Constitution. They're the ultimate interpreter. So that when we look at the powers of the President, the Congress, and the Court, what we see is a balance of powers. We see that each branch has special prerogatives. But there is a delicate balance between the three. Professor, which branch has the greatest power? Trick question. No branch has greater power. They are separate but equal in power. The three branches exist in a separate but equal power sharing. Separate but equal. Did Jefferson win by Marbury not getting his job? Well, I guess to a degree he won, but he got something unexpected, didn't he? What he got unexpected was that the United States Supreme Court exerted its authority and established itself in exercising judicial review. Stop for a minute. A big deal? A very big deal, isn't it? How the court operates in our society, the court's decision-making in our society. It becomes a very big deal. Continue. Jefferson lowered the amount of money necessary. Jefferson lowered the money contributions needed in order to buy land in the American Northwest. Jefferson lowered the amount of money that would be necessary in order for someone to purchase land in the American Northwest. Jefferson lowered the purchase price for land in the American Northwest. You know why he did this. You know that Jefferson was interested in making it relatively easy for individuals to be landowners. Jefferson lowers the purchase requirement for land in the American Northwest because he wanted to make it relatively easy for people to own land. In conjunction with purchasing the Louisiana Territory, write this down, in conjunction with the purchase of the Louisiana Territory, this would mean that humble people with a high birth rate, humble people who have a lot of children, could expect that they could be landowners. Poor people who do not have a lot of money, but poor people who have a lot of children, they can expect that their children will have some economic opportunity in owning land. Why is that such a big deal? They do represent a certain future. He's saying something important. This will be a poor person's country. America will be the greatest poor people's country because there's a place for poor people. Stop for a moment and think how this would exist, how this would occur in Great Britain, where the differences between the poor and the rich were totally, completely extraordinary, where the poor people had a right to breathe, but very little else, relatively speaking. But in America, as a poor person, you had a hope and a dream and the likelihood that you might be able to own something, pass it on, give it to your children, and for your children to have something. This was a poor people's country. And Jefferson, by lowering the property requirement, and by purchasing Louisiana, and by dreaming of people having something, Jefferson, in a sense, was, as the gentleman suggested, Jefferson was blazing a path for what America would be like. Jefferson would be setting a standard for what America would be like. Let me just mention something that will be significant in very short order. You recognize that Jefferson represented a difference of opinion with Hamilton and the Federalist persuasion. Is that correct? Jefferson takes a totally different perspective than does Hamilton and did the Federalist. What does Jefferson, in a sense, do by lowering property requirements, by expanding the public domain, and by articulating a philosophy that met the reality of people's lives? When I say met the realities of people's lives, I simply mean it was very common for people to marry very young. And not only would one marry very young, that would simply mean that there would be a high birth rate. And people would go through multiple marriages. It'd be very common for a young woman to be married 2 or 3 times. And for men, for example, to marry women who would frequently be older than the women that they would marry. So the point is that the birth rate is a very high birth rate. A very high birth rate among people who have almost nothing. It was okay to be poor. It was okay to have a lot of children. It didn't necessarily diminish your life. How many of you expect to have 9 children? Anybody going to have 9 children? How about 8.5 children? Anybody going to have 8.5 children? Because you realize something. You realize that in all likelihood, the number of children that you have has a lot to say in regards to your upward economic mobility. The more children that you have, the more difficult the road. It's no surprise that the birth rate in the United States is very low. Everything's very expensive. Have you noticed? Not so in Jefferson's age. In Jefferson's age, having a lot of children, in a lot of ways, was a hedge against poverty. In a lot of ways, in Jefferson's age, having a lot of children was a hedge against poverty. It's simply a hedge. When I say a hedge, I simply mean almost a safety net. My name is Richard Clayman. Remember me, I live in a shoe. I have 7 children. I have more children than I have teeth. The reason that one has children is to protect oneself. I have 7 children to protect me again in my old age. Even though I can't afford children, there's nothing much to afford. Everyone will have the same, nothing. I'll give everyone the same. Everyone will have nothing, and we will still survive. That's what America was like. But something else is going to happen here. What about those rich people? What about those Federalists? They will be outproduced by poor people. There are more poor people than rich people, right? In this era, there will be many, many more poor people. And those poor people increasingly will have the power to vote. There'll be many, many poor people, but these poor people will have the ability to vote. Uh-oh, uh-oh. Can you sense this democracy? What democracy would mean? What would the founding fathers say? What did Hofstadter tell you about the fear of poor people participating? They worried about it. They worried about it, not Jefferson. Jefferson welcomed it. Jefferson welcomed that poor people would change the character of the nation. He's a fox, isn't he? Jefferson is a fox in this regards. Next idea. New point. As you know, there were historic problems regarding the American merchant marine fleet. There were historic problems regarding the American merchant marine fleet. Americans could make money by taking agricultural products and livestock and selling them in Europe. American farm productivity always tended to be high. American hog productivity was high. So as a result, Americans could make money by taking the plentiful agricultural products and selling them in Great Britain and on the continent. This particularly is significant whenever there would be struggles in Europe. Whenever there would be war in Europe, that would mean that America's agricultural products would even be more important. America's agricultural products would even be more important in any kind of struggle. America's agricultural products would always be important, would always be a way of making revenue. But the revenue would be more significant in a period of war. Because in a period of war, one country is always trying to interfere and interrupt the productivity taking place within the opposing country. It's only natural. That's why Britain, for example, would very often blockade France, and France would attempt to blockade Britain, and they would try to starve one another out. Therefore, the Americans became particularly significant because the Americans brought the food that was necessary to keep not only the people satisfied, but to keep armies in the field. American agricultural products would become as important as weapons or as blood itself. America's agricultural products would be very, very significant. America's agricultural products would be very, very significant. Because of the ongoing hostilities between Britain and France in this period of time, the American merchant marine fleet found itself frequently attacked by both countries. The American merchant marine fleet frequently found itself attacked by both countries. Hold on. Because of the hostilities between Britain and France, these hostilities we would call the Napoleonic Wars. These hostilities between Britain and France from 1789 in effect right through 1800, these hostilities in many regards are related to the struggle with Napoleon. In this struggle, America made money. But in making money, America made enemies. Point number one. The British Navy would frequently stop American ships on the high seas. The British Navy would frequently stop ships on the high seas. And in stopping ships on the high seas, they would board the ship and asked the men on the ship who they were and where they were from. What's your name?
Robert.
Robert what?
Largington.
Mr. Largington, they would say, where are you from? He would say, I'm from Charlestown, Massachusetts. You're from Charlestown? Where was your father from? My father came from Great Britain. Mr. Largington, come with us. You are now in the British Navy. He would be removed from the ship. He'd be removed from the ship, and he would be, quote unquote, enlisted in the British Navy, where he would spend God knows how many years. This is called something. What is this called? This is called impressment. 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 I-M-P-R-E-S-S-M-E-N-T. This is called impressment. When the British Navy took American seamen off the ships and signed them up to the British Navy. This is called impressment. This impressment, would this be infuriating to the United States government? Would this be infuriating? Would this be infuriating to the idea of the identity of Americans? Remember what the British said about Americans. You Americans, you are nothing. You are one big nothing. Once you were our cousin. When you were our cousin, you were something. Now you are not our cousin. You are nothing. And that's why we are going to take you and do what we wish with you. What could the United States government do in this regards? You're going to fight the greatest navy in the world. Here you are, a fragile little entity. Here you are, you're like a spider's web, and you're going to take on the most powerful navy in the world. You could do that. You could cut your nose off, couldn't you? You could cut your nose off in order to prevent. Now there won't be a problem. You won't just make any money. That's good. That's good. Let's all be poor. Let's take the vow of poverty for the whole country. You could do that. What else could you do? If you're a businessman, what do? The British came aboard your ship. They took 5 people off your ship, and then they took the cargo off your ship. If you're a businessman, what do? The next time you send a shipment of pigs over, it's double the price. The next time you send corn over, it's triple the price. You want it, you pay for it. That's what the Americans do in order to navigate through it all. And that works. That works during the Washington administration. That works during the Adams administration. Even though with the Adams administration, there's a lot of anti-French activity taking place. And it works during the Jefferson administration too, until finally Jefferson decides to take another route. What's he do?
He decides to have an embargo.
He decides to issue an embargo, the embargo of 1807 and 1808. He issues an embargo. What is this embargo about? He says, we will trade with no country that takes our shipping. So that if France takes our ships, we won't trade with France. If Britain takes our ships, we won't trade with any of them. We won't trade with France. We won't trade with Britain. That will teach them, Jefferson says. That will teach them. We won't trade with them, Jefferson says. That will send them a message. Jefferson's trying to punish them. That will teach them. We'll send them none of our corn. We won't send them our hogs. Their food prices will go very high. There'll be starvation. That will teach them to take our ships. Little do they know that Britain and France get corn and hogs from other places too. And what happens in America?
Poverty increases.
There is a depression. There is a depression. There is a depression that sets in. There is a depression. There's a depression that sets in. Because a businessman can always double the price, but not to trade at all, not to trade at all, creates an economic cycle that keeps going down. And so there is a depression. Are people normally happy during a depression? Are we happy in America today? We're not, are we? Ultimately, in 1808, Jefferson will leave office. Jefferson will leave office. The Embargo Acts will be rescinded, will be wiped off the books. Jefferson will leave office in 1808. The Embargo Acts will be wiped off the books. James Madison will be president. James Madison will be president. And Madison will ultimately take the country for the second time, the second and the last time, to war with Great Britain. Madison will take the country for what will be the second time, the second and the very last time, to war with Great Britain. The War of 1812, the War of 1812 will have as one of its reasons, one of the reasons that this war will break out, just one, will be the question of impressment. One of the reasons that this war will break out will be this unresolved problem over impressment, the taking of American sailors. That'll be one reason. That'll be one reason that this war will break out. But there is another reason. There's another reason. Remember all of those children? Remember that high birth rate? That high birth rate? A high birth rate that begins to move into Kentucky, into Tennessee, that begins to move into Alabama and Mississippi. This movement of Americans on the frontier, moving ever steadily into the frontier, hitting what? Hitting what?
The Mississippi River.
Hitting what?
Native American lands.
Hitting those small and large tribes of Native Americans. Remember the proclamation of 1763? Remember what Britain did in 1763? We don't want you going beyond the Appalachian Mountains, the British said. Now we are way beyond the Appalachian Mountains. And just as the British predicted, we would hit a multitude of Native American tribes. And these Native American tribes rapidly got the picture that white people were dangerous, that white people cannot be trusted. And rapidly they came to the conclusion that it might be a good idea to kill as many of these white people as they possibly could. Settlement, as settlement goes west, or settlement goes into what's called the Ohio River Valley. As settlement moves into the Ohio River Valley, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, moving into northern Alabama, northern Mississippi, moving into Louisiana, big geographical area, these white people begin to believe something. They believe that these native people have to be either moved or destroyed. These white people believe that these native people have to be either moved or destroyed. But there's a problem. There's a problem, they believe. The Americans have a problem. They believe in a little conspiracy. What's the conspiracy?
The Brits?
They see the British as what? Americans say the British, they're providing guns to these native people. The British are providing guns to these native people. The British are organizing these native people. The British are responsible for exciting these native people. The British are responsible for this. This is a revenge of the British. This is a revenge of Britain. So my name is Richard Clayman. I live in Ohio, in a shoe with 7 children. Do I care about the ocean? Do I care about impressment? Maybe a little, but not a lot. But I certainly care about something else, don't I? Cheap land? Cheap land for my 7 children? Cheap land for myself, remember me, with no teeth? Do I care about land? And I believe that the British are responsible. In 1810, there will be the 12th Congress of the United States will meet in 1810. In this 12th Congress, there will be many representatives. In this 12th Congress, there will be many representatives of individuals who live on the frontier. There's a name that we give to these frontier people. These are young Americans in their late teens, early 20s. These people we will call the Warhawks. These are the Warhawks. They're the Warhawks. You know the idea, well, one American can take 10 of any other people? That kind of talk? That talk was prevalent in 1810. That talk was a catalyst in bringing on war with Great Britain. The Warhawks were individuals who preached the idea of going to war with Great Britain. The Warhawks preached about going to war with Great Britain. And that is what happened. war with Great Britain breaks out. Not just because of impressment, not just because of insults on the high seas, but war breaks out because American people on the frontier wanted to destroy native people quicker. They wanted to take over native land quicker. And they believed that the British were an impediment to this taking place. Can you see that? That's why this war breaks out. Questions? That's another problem. That's another problem of having a merchant marine fleet that goes far and wide and cannot protect itself. That existed. The American Marine Fleet, again, mostly unarmed or very lightly armed in an environment that they could not control. That was a problem that the Jefferson administration faced. They also would take American ships and American seamen and ransom them. By the way, déjà vu. Isn't that what we see today in many places, in the Middle East in particular, where particular people take American shipping and other shipping and ransom the shipping, demand that a ransom be paid for it? We witness today modern-day piracy. Modern-day piracy is no different from the piracy that existed in 1806 and 1805. The problem was that the American military, as I say, was very much in its infancy. It could not protect itself. You will recall, ladies and gentlemen, that the Federalists believed it was necessary to create American Navy, to spend money, to build an American Navy that could protect itself. That's what President Adams tried to do. When President Jefferson came into the presidency, he said, well, let's not spend as much on that. We don't really want to do that. That was an error. What's the number one maxim for any country? What's the job of any country? Number one, the first idea.
Protect its people and itself?
Do not die. Do not die. Do not allow yourself to die in any shape or form. As a country, as a prisoner of war, stay alive. That's number one. That's the number one goal, to stay alive, to fight for another day, not to allow yourself to die.